Before we begin, if you love emotional mafia stories filled with loyalty, secrets, and unforgettable love, please subscribe, like, and share this video. Your support helps us bring more stories like this. Now let's begin. The most dangerous secrets are never shouted. They are whispered after someone believes the call has already ended. I have spent my entire life believing that control could protect me from betrayal. Every meeting, every contract, every promise was measured, tested, and locked behind another layer of certainty. That was the only way a man like me survived. The city knew my name because my company rebuilt ports, warehouses, and shipping routes across the East Coast. The people who knew a little more understood that the Hayes family had influence extending far beyond boardrooms. I accepted both versions of myself long ago. The businessman, the protector, the man who trusted almost no one. Then Madeline Brooks walked into my life carrying rolled architectural drawings under one arm and coffee in the other, apologizing because she thought she had interrupted a meeting. She had no idea that everyone else in the room had been terrified to speak while she casually smiled and asked where she should leave the blueprints. She never treated me like a powerful man. She treated me like someone who had skipped lunch too many times and needed to remember that normal people laugh during conversations. That annoyed me at first. Then it became the one thing I waited for every day. 16 months later, our engagement should have been the easiest decision either of us had ever made. The estate overlooked the Atlantic, where waves rolled against dark rocks below the cliffs, and white light stretched across the gardens as workers prepared for a celebration that would fill every photograph with impossible perfection. Reporters would only see elegance. Friends would only see happiness. No one would notice how carefully I watched every detail because habits like mine never disappeared. Even joy was something I inspected before I accepted it. Madeline laughed somewhere inside the house while speaking with the staff, and the sound echoed through the hallway like sunlight reaching places that had forgotten warmth. I remember thinking that perhaps people could change after all. Perhaps trust was not weakness. My phone vibrated in my pocket just as my assistant reminded me that our attorney was waiting upstairs. I answered the business call while walking toward the library, discussing schedules, signatures, and security arrangements for guests arriving from 3 different states. It lasted less than 2 minutes. I ended the conversation and slipped the phone into the inside pocket of my jacket without looking at the screen. At least I thought I had ended it. I reached the library door when another voice quietly emerged from the speaker. Madeline. Soft. Calm. Completely unaware. She wasn't speaking to me. She was speaking to Eleanor, the elderly housemaid who had practically become family to everyone working at the estate. Promise me something, Madeline whispered. There was a long pause filled only by distant footsteps and the faint clink of china from the kitchen downstairs. Eleanor answered so quietly I could barely hear her. Then Madeline spoke again, every word measured as though she had rehearsed them 100 times before finding the courage to say them aloud. If he ever learns the truth, promise me you'll burn every letter before sunrise. Every muscle in my body locked into place. My hand remained frozen on the brass doorknob while the world around me continued as if nothing had happened. The ocean still crashed below the cliffs. Workers still laughed outside while arranging flowers. Somewhere, a violinist practiced tomorrow's ceremony. Yet all I could hear was that single sentence repeating inside my mind. Every instinct I had spent decades sharpening suddenly awakened at once. The call disconnected a heartbeat later, leaving only silence. I stared at the dark screen, wondering whether I had truly heard what I thought I had heard. Then the library door opened from the inside, and Madeline smiled at me with the same gentle expression that had slowly convinced me the impossible was real. There you are, she said. I've been looking everywhere for you. I smiled back because it was the only thing I knew how to do. But somewhere deep beneath that practiced smile, the first crack had already appeared. I followed her into the library with the same measured steps I had used for years in boardrooms where every smile usually concealed another negotiation. Madeline noticed nothing unusual. She crossed the room, placed a stack of architectural drawings across the antique oak table, and began talking excitedly about restoring the old carriage house into a guest cottage instead of tearing it down. She believed every place deserved a second chance if someone cared enough to understand its history. I listened to every word, yet none of them settled in my mind. My thoughts remained trapped inside that unfinished conversation I had never been meant to hear. She looked up and smiled when she realized I had not answered. "You are somewhere else today," she said with a playful grin. "Do not tell me you are already thinking about tomorrow's schedule." I forced a quiet laugh. "Something like that." She walked closer and gently straightened my tie without hesitation. It was such an ordinary gesture that it should have erased every doubt inside me. Instead, it made the questions even heavier. If she was hiding something, why did she still look at me with such warmth? If she was protecting me, then why keep secrets at all? Before I could search for an answer, Eleanor entered the room carrying a silver tray with fresh coffee. The elderly housemaid had worked for the Hayes family for more than 30 years. She greeted me with the same kindness she had shown ever since I was a restless teenager pretending that nothing ever frightened me. Our eyes met for only a second. It was enough to notice something I had never seen before. She looked away first. Just for an instant. Just long enough for instinct to whisper that she was carrying a burden she wished I would never discover. Madeline thanked her, picked up a coffee cup, and continued discussing flowers, guest seating, and music as though tomorrow would simply be another beautiful beginning. Eleanor quietly excused herself. I watched the library door close behind her before turning back toward the woman I loved. "Do you trust Eleanor?" asked as casually as I could. Madeline did not hesitate. "With my life," she answered. The certainty in her voice should have comforted me. Instead, it echoed against the sentence I had overheard only minutes earlier. That evening the estate slowly transformed beneath hundreds of warm lights hanging across the gardens. Caterers moved between long tables covered with white linen, while musicians tested microphones near the ocean terrace. Friends and business partners arrived from New York, Boston, and Charleston, greeting us with congratulations and expensive gifts wrapped in elegant paper. Cameras flashed. Glasses touched. Laughter floated through the summer air. Every image captured the perfect future. I stood beside Madeline, smiled for photographs, shook hands, and thanked every guest. No one noticed that my attention drifted whenever she stepped away for even a moment. She spoke with designers. She hugged her college roommate. She helped one of the younger servers calm his nerves after he accidentally dropped a tray of empty glasses. She was exactly the woman I had fallen in love with. Generous, patient, completely herself, which only made the mystery harder to understand. Later that night, after the final guests had returned to their rooms, I remained alone on the balcony overlooking the Atlantic. The tide rolled steadily beneath the moonlight, and the cool breeze carried the scent of salt across the cliffs. My longtime security director, Daniel Mercer, quietly approached without interrupting my thoughts. He had known me long enough to recognize when silence meant something serious. "Everything ready for tomorrow?" I asked without looking away from the water. "Yes," he replied. "Is something wrong?" I waited several seconds before answering. "I need you to verify something for me." He frowned slightly but said nothing. I trusted him because he never asked unnecessary questions. Discreetly, I continued. "I want every public record connected to Madeline Brooks. Her past projects, former employers, property records, anything unusual. No rumors, no shortcuts. Facts only." Daniel studied my expression carefully. "Does she know?" "No." "Does anyone else?" "No." "One." He nodded once. "You will have a report by tomorrow afternoon." As he disappeared into the shadows, I remained standing alone with the sound of the waves below. For the first time since Madeline had entered my life, I chose investigation over conversation. I told myself I was protecting our future. Deep inside, however, another thought quietly refused to disappear. What if the greatest mistake of my life had already begun the moment I decided not to ask her a single honest question? Morning arrived wrapped in pale gray clouds drifting above the Atlantic, and the estate felt strangely quieter than it had the day before. Staff members moved through the hallways preparing for the engagement celebration, while florists adjusted white roses one final time and musicians tuned their instruments near the terrace. Everything appeared exactly as it should have been, yet I had begun noticing details I would have ignored only 24 hours earlier. Madeline paused every time she passed the Old West hallway, almost as though she were remembering something. Eleanor carried a small brass key on a chain beneath her uniform, although I had never seen her wear it before. Even the grandfather clock in the foyer seemed louder, each passing minute sounding less like time and more like a countdown. Daniel Mercer returned just before noon carrying a slim leather folder instead of his usual tablet. He placed it on my desk without speaking. That alone told me the information inside deserved careful attention. I opened the folder expecting hidden debts, suspicious associates, or unexplained travel. Instead, I found something entirely different. Madeline Brooks had an almost impossibly ordinary history. Excellent academic records. Award-winning restoration projects across 3 states. Volunteer work preserving historic churches and community libraries. No lawsuits. No financial irregularities. No hidden properties. No unexplained transfers. Every page described the same woman I believed I knew. Daniel folded his hands behind his back. I kept looking because it seemed too clean, he admitted. Did you find anything? I asked. He hesitated before sliding one final sheet across the desk. Only this. It was not a report. It was a photograph taken nearly 8 years earlier outside a restored lighthouse along the Maine coast. Madeline stood beside a much younger Eleanor, both smiling into the camera while holding rolled architectural plans. My eyes narrowed. She knew Eleanor before she met me. Daniel nodded once. According to employment records, Eleanor volunteered for a historical preservation charity after retiring for 2 years. Madeline worked on the same project. Their connection began long before either of them entered your life. I stared at the photograph longer than I should have. Neither woman looked guilty. They looked proud, happy, genuine. Yet one question refused to disappear. Why had neither of them ever mentioned knowing each other? I closed the folder and slipped the photograph into my jacket pocket. Do not investigate any further, I said quietly. Daniel looked surprised. Are you certain? For now. He accepted the instruction without argument and left the office. That afternoon I found Madeline sitting alone inside the restored greenhouse behind the estate. Sunlight filtered through old glass panels, filling the room with warm reflections that danced across rows of lavender and white orchids. She smiled the moment she saw me. I escaped for 5 minutes, she laughed. Everyone keeps asking about seating charts. I sat beside her on the wooden bench, close enough to hear her steady breathing. She reached for my hand without hesitation. You look exhausted, she whispered. Are you worried about the guests? I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to place the photograph between us and simply ask why she had hidden something so small. Instead, I heard myself asking a different question. Have you ever believed that protecting someone sometimes requires keeping a secret? Her smile faded, replaced by thoughtful silence. She looked toward the greenhouse windows where raindrops had begun tapping softly against the glass. Sometimes, she answered carefully, but secrets always have a cost. The longer you carry one, the heavier it becomes. Those words settled deep inside me because they sounded less like theory and more like experience. Before I could ask another question, her phone vibrated across the bench. She glanced at the screen, and for the first time since I had met her, genuine concern crossed her face. She stood almost immediately. I need to check on something. I will only be gone a few minutes. She kissed my cheek gently and hurried toward the garden path without noticing that she had left her notebook behind. I reached for it only to return it later, but a folded piece of aged stationery slipped onto the floor. Across the front, written in faded blue ink, were 6 words that instantly tightened every muscle in my body. Do not let Nathaniel learn everything. My fingers remained suspended above the folded letter for several long seconds. Every instinct told me to unfold it immediately. Every promise I had ever made to Madeline told me to leave it exactly where it had fallen. In the end, habit defeated hope. I carefully opened the aged paper, making certain not to crease it any further. The handwriting matched the faded words on the outside. Elegant, deliberate, familiar in a way I could not immediately explain. The message itself was painfully short. If the day ever comes when Nathaniel begins asking questions, tell him only what he is ready to carry. Some truths protect him only while they remain unfinished. There was no signature, no date, nothing that explained who had written it or why Madeline had kept it hidden inside her notebook. I read the words again, searching for anger inside myself. Instead, I found confusion. Whoever wrote this letter did not sound like an enemy. They sounded like someone trying to shield me from something I had never known existed. I quietly folded the paper exactly as I had found it, and slipped it back between the notebook pages just moments before Madeline returned carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. She smiled the same gentle smile that had slowly dismantled every wall I had spent years building around my life. "You found my notebook," she said with an embarrassed laugh. "I cannot believe I almost forgot it." I handed it back without letting my expression change. "You have been distracted today." She nodded softly. "Tomorrow is a big day. I suppose I have earned the right to be a little nervous." There was honesty in her voice, yet I could no longer tell how much of it I truly understood. We walked back toward the main house together while guests continued arriving throughout the afternoon. Luxury sedans rolled through the front gate one after another. Old family friends stepped onto the stone driveway carrying carefully wrapped gifts and warm congratulations. Laughter filled the entrance hall as photographers prepared for evening portraits. The entire estate seemed wrapped in celebration. Only I knew that another story was unfolding beneath the polished surface. During dinner, I noticed Eleanor quietly excuse herself before dessert was served. She carried a small wooden box no larger than a hardcover novel, holding it carefully against her side as though it contained something fragile rather than valuable. She disappeared through the service hallway leading toward the older wing of the estate. No one else appeared to notice. I continued speaking with investors seated beside me, while keeping her movements in the corner of my vision. A few minutes later, Madeline also stood from the table after apologizing to our guests. She walked in the same direction without realizing I had seen her leave. I waited exactly 60 seconds before following at an unhurried pace. The older hallway remained almost silent compared with the celebration taking place only a few rooms away. Soft evening light filtered through stained glass windows, painting long bands of blue and gold across the hardwood floor. I stopped before reaching the end of the corridor after hearing quiet voices behind a partially closed door. Eleanor spoke first. "He is beginning to notice," Madeline answered with a sigh that carried more sadness than fear. "I always knew this day would come." My heartbeat grew heavier, but I stayed where I was. There was no anger driving me forward anymore, only an overwhelming need to understand. Through the narrow opening, I could see the wooden box resting on an old writing desk beside several yellowed envelopes tied together with a faded blue ribbon. Madeline carefully placed her hand over the bundle but did not open it. "If he reads these before everything is ready," she whispered, "he will spend the rest of his life blaming the wrong person." Eleanor gently nodded. "Then we keep our promise a little longer." Neither woman sounded dishonest. Neither sounded manipulative. They sounded heartbroken. I quietly stepped backward before either of them could notice my presence and returned to the dining room wearing the same composed expression every guest expected to see. Conversation resumed around me as though nothing had happened, yet the pieces no longer fit together the way they had yesterday. Every secret I uncovered only made Madeline appear less guilty and far more burdened. Then, just as coffee was being served, my phone vibrated with a secure message from Daniel Mercer. It contained only one sentence. "I found someone who remembers the letters, and he insists your late father ordered them hidden, not destroyed." Daniel rarely sounded uncertain, but when I called him a few minutes later, the silence on the other end of the line lasted almost as long as his first sentence. "His name is Walter Griffin," he finally said. "He managed legal archives for your father more than 20 years ago. He agreed to speak only because he believes time has become more dangerous than the truth." I stepped away from the celebration and walked onto the eastern veranda where the evening breeze carried the scent of salt across the estate. Laughter floated through the open windows behind me, while waves rolled steadily against the cliffs below. Two completely different worlds existed only a few feet apart. "Where is he now?" I asked. "A small coastal town in Maine. He retired years ago." I verified his identity through 3 independent records. I closed my eyes for a brief moment. Did he explain the message? Only part of it. He said your father never wanted the letters destroyed. He wanted them hidden until the right time. Walter claims your father believed those documents could either save the Hayes family or destroy it, depending on who discovered them first. The call ended, but the questions refused to disappear. I returned inside just as another round of congratulations surrounded Madeline. She thanked every guest with genuine warmth, remembering names, asking about children, and making everyone feel as though they mattered. Watching her should have eased my mind. Instead, I noticed something new. Every few minutes her eyes drifted toward the antique grandfather clock in the foyer. Not with fear, with expectation, as though she were waiting for a specific hour to arrive. I quietly memorized each glance without confronting her. Later that evening, after the last visitors retired to their guest suites, I found myself unable to sleep. The estate had finally grown quiet. Only the distant sound of the Atlantic and the occasional creak of old wooden beams disturbed the silence. I walked through the dim hallway until I reached the family portrait gallery, a place I had avoided for years. My father's oil portrait still hung above the fireplace exactly where it had always been. Calm expression, perfect posture. A man admired by the public and understood by almost no one. As a child, I believed he never made mistakes. As an adult, I discovered that powerful men often buried their regrets deeper than anyone else. My attention drifted toward an old photograph displayed beneath the portrait. It showed my parents standing beside the very lighthouse that appeared in the picture Daniel had found of Madeline and Eleanor. I had walked past that photograph hundreds of times without ever wondering why it had been placed there. Now every forgotten detail seemed to demand an answer. The following morning arrived bright and clear. Sunlight poured through the windows while the estate buzzed with preparations for the engagement ceremony. Tailors delivered final adjustments. Florists replaced every blossom that had wilted overnight. Musicians rehearsed one final time on the ocean terrace. Everything moved according to schedule except my thoughts. While passing through the main hallway, I noticed Eleanor carrying the same small wooden box toward the old family library. She looked around carefully before disappearing inside. A few moments later Madeline joined her, closing the door quietly behind her. I approached without making a sound. This time I did not stand close enough to hear every word. Instead, I caught only fragments carried through the narrow gap beneath the door. "Tonight," Eleanor whispered. "He deserves to know." Madeline answered so softly that I barely recognized her voice. "Only after I can prove it. Otherwise he will never forgive himself." My chest tightened. Forgive himself. Not forgive her. The difference was impossible to ignore. I stepped away before the floorboards could betray my presence. For the first time since overhearing that forgotten phone call, certainty began slipping through my hands. Perhaps I had not been uncovering a conspiracy at all. Perhaps I had been walking through the edges of a sacrifice I did not yet understand. As I reached the front staircase, my assistant hurried toward me holding an unmarked envelope that had just arrived by courier. There was no return address. Only my name written across the front in careful blue ink. Inside was a single vintage photograph of my father shaking hands with a man I had never seen before. And on the back someone had written one sentence that changed everything again. "Ask Madeline why the lighthouse mattered before you ask who wrote the letters." The envelope remained in my jacket pocket for the rest of the afternoon, yet it felt heavier than anything I had ever carried. I read the handwritten sentence so many times that the blue ink seemed permanently etched into my thoughts. "Ask Madeline why the lighthouse mattered before you ask who wrote the letters." Whoever had sent it knew exactly where my attention had been drifting. They also knew there was a question more important than every secret I had uncovered so far. The engagement ceremony was only a few hours away, and the estate had become a living painting of white flowers, polished stone paths, and guests arriving with warm smiles that carried no suspicion. Everywhere I looked, people celebrated the future they believed they were witnessing. Only I knew that the foundation beneath it had begun to shift. Madeline found me standing alone near the western garden where the ocean breeze carried the scent of blooming hydrangeas across the lawn. She slipped her hand into mine without saying anything at first. That quiet confidence had always been one of the things I admired most about her. She never believed every silence needed to be filled with words. We walked together along the stone path until we reached the old gazebo overlooking the cliffs. "You have been somewhere far away these last 2 days," she said softly. "I can see it in your eyes." I looked toward the horizon where sunlight reflected across the Atlantic in long ribbons of silver. Every instinct urged me to ask about the letters, the notebook, the hidden conversations, and the lighthouse. Instead, I heard myself asking only one question. Have you ever been afraid that telling the truth at the wrong moment could hurt someone more than keeping quiet? She did not answer immediately. She rested both hands on the weathered wooden railing and watched a flock of seabirds circle above the water. "Every single day," she whispered. "Timing does not change the truth, Nathaniel. It only changes whether someone is ready to survive hearing it." Those words settled into the same place where every other clue had gathered. None of them sounded like deception. They sounded like someone carrying a responsibility that had grown too heavy to hold alone. Before I could continue, one of the event coordinators hurried toward us, apologizing because several guests wanted photographs before sunset. Madeline smiled politely and squeezed my hand once before following her back toward the estate. I remained at the gazebo for another minute, replaying every conversation in my mind. Then Daniel Mercer called. "Walter Griffin agreed to meet," he said. "He refuses to discuss anything over the phone. He asked for one place only." "Where?" I asked. "The old lighthouse in Maine." My grip tightened around the phone. "When?" "Tomorrow morning." I looked back toward the estate where musicians had begun rehearsing and guests gathered beneath strings of warm lights. Tomorrow morning was supposed to be the first day of our new life together. Instead, it threatened to become the beginning of answers that reached decades into the past. As evening settled over the property, I returned inside and passed the family library. The door stood slightly open. Through the narrow gap I saw Eleanor placing the small wooden box into a hidden compartment behind a row of old history books. She closed the panel carefully before turning toward the window, never noticing that I had paused outside. There was no fear in her face, only sadness. The kind of sadness carried by someone honoring a promise they wished they had never been asked to make. I quietly continued walking before she could discover me there. Later, during dinner, conversation flowed easily around the long candlelit table. Friends shared stories. Glasses were raised. Laughter echoed beneath the high ceilings. Madeline looked radiant, but every now and then I caught her studying me with quiet concern, as though she sensed the distance growing between us even if she did not yet know why. Then, just as dessert was served, my assistant leaned down beside my chair and whispered that a visitor had arrived unexpectedly. He claimed he had known my father, refused to give his full name, and insisted on delivering one message before leaving. I stepped outside to meet him, but the driveway was already empty. Only a small leather journal rested on the front steps. Inside the cover, written in unmistakably my father's handwriting, were 8 words that made every secret feel suddenly connected. "Everything begins and ends at Black Harbor Lighthouse." The journal remained open on my desk long after midnight, its worn leather cover carrying the faint scent of salt and old paper as though it had spent years hidden beside the sea instead of inside a family archive. I had read my father's 8 handwritten words so many times that they no longer felt like a message. They felt like an invitation. Or perhaps a warning. Everything begins and ends at Black Harbor Lighthouse. Outside my window the Atlantic stretched into darkness beneath a silver moon. And somewhere beyond that horizon stood the place where every clue seemed determined to lead me. Sleep never came. At sunrise the estate awakened with renewed excitement. Today was supposed to be remembered as the happiest day of my life. Staff members polished crystal glasses until they sparkled beneath the morning light. Fresh flowers replaced those that had wilted overnight. Guests wandered through the gardens carrying coffee cups while laughing about wedding plans and future vacations. Every face reflected certainty except mine. Madeline appeared on the front terrace wearing a simple cream-colored dress while reviewing ceremony details with the event coordinator. She noticed me watching from across the courtyard and smiled with the same warmth that had once made every difficult decision feel easy. For a brief moment I almost walked toward her intending to ask every question that had haunted me for 2 days. Then I remembered the letter inside her notebook. The hidden wooden box. Eleanor's promise. My father's journal. I remained where I was. Daniel arrived quietly beside me carrying a folded map. Black Harbor Lighthouse is approximately 400 miles north, he said. Walter Griffin confirmed he will wait until tomorrow afternoon. He insists that if you arrive after sunset, he will leave without speaking. I studied the map before folding it closed. Make the arrangements. No one else needs to know. Daniel hesitated. Does that include Madeline? His question lingered longer than I expected. Especially Madeline, I finally answered, though the words felt heavier than they should have. Hours passed beneath perfect blue skies. Musicians rehearsed gentle melodies while photographers positioned guests along the ocean terrace. Every detail reflected celebration, yet I found myself noticing something entirely different. Madeline disappeared for exactly 12 minutes just before lunch. She returned carrying nothing, but a faint trace of dust rested against the sleeve of her dress, the kind left behind after touching old wooden shelves or forgotten storage rooms. She caught me looking and instinctively brushed it away before realizing what she had done. Neither of us mentioned it. That afternoon Eleanor approached me while I stood alone overlooking the cliffs. Her expression carried the calm dignity of someone who had accepted difficult responsibilities long ago. "She loves you more than you understand," she said quietly. I looked at her in surprise. I never asked a question. She offered a gentle smile. Sometimes silence asks the loudest ones. We stood together listening to the waves below. Finally I spoke. "How long have you known her?" Eleanor looked toward the horizon instead of answering immediately. "Long enough to know that she has spent years protecting someone else's peace while quietly giving up her own." I waited for more, but she simply shook her head. "The truth belongs to her, not to me." Before leaving, she reached into her apron pocket and placed a small brass key in my hand. It was the same key I had noticed hanging beneath her uniform days earlier. "If circumstances change before tomorrow," she whispered, "this opens the hidden compartment in the library. But promise me one thing. Do not use it unless there is no other choice." I stared at the weathered key resting in my palm while she slowly walked back toward the estate. Moments later applause erupted from the terrace as guests gathered for photographs. Madeline stood at the center of every smiling face. Yet when our eyes met across the crowd, I saw something I had never noticed before. She was not worried that I would discover the truth. She was worried that I would discover it too soon. Then, just as the photographer asked everyone to hold their smiles, a black luxury sedan rolled through the front gate. None of the security team had expected its arrival, and the driver stepped out carrying only a single sealed envelope addressed in my father's handwriting to one person alone: Madeline Brooks. Every conversation around me disappeared the moment I saw Madeline staring at the envelope. She did not reach for it immediately. Instead, she looked toward me with an expression I had never seen before, one filled with recognition rather than surprise. It was as though she had always known this day would eventually arrive. The elderly courier removed his cap respectfully before placing the sealed envelope into her hands. "I was instructed to deliver this only when both of you stood beneath the same roof," he said quietly. "I have honored that promise for 12 years. Without waiting for another question, he returned to the black sedan and slowly drove away through the front gate. Guests continued talking and laughing, completely unaware that anything unusual had happened. Madeline held the envelope carefully, almost reverently, running her fingertips across my father's familiar handwriting without opening it. "You recognize it," I finally said. She looked at me for several long seconds before nodding. "Yes." It was the first direct answer she had given since this strange chain of events began. "Then tell me why." Her eyes softened with sadness rather than fear. "Because he trusted me with something long before you ever knew my name." My heartbeat slowed instead of racing. Every clue had pointed toward betrayal. Yet every answer somehow pointed in the opposite direction. We quietly stepped away from the gathering and walked into the old conservatory where sunlight filtered through the glass ceiling onto rows of restored plants. The celebration outside became little more than distant echoes. Madeline placed the envelope on an antique table between us without breaking the wax seal. "Your father asked me never to open this unless two conditions were met," she said. "The first was that we were both standing together. The second was that you had already started asking the right questions instead of the easiest ones." I stared at the envelope. "You have been carrying this responsibility for 12 years? She nodded once. "Not the envelope. Only the promise." My mind struggled to keep pace with the truth unfolding before me. 12 years earlier we had never met. She had still been in graduate school studying architectural preservation, while I was expanding my company's shipping business across the East Coast. "How could my father possibly know you?" I asked. A gentle smile appeared across her face, though it carried more nostalgia than happiness. "He did not know me first. He knew my grandfather." She slowly unfolded a small photograph she had carried inside her notebook. It showed an older man standing beside my father outside Black Harbor Lighthouse. They were smiling like lifelong friends. My grandfather, Thomas Brooks, spent decades restoring historical landmarks. Your father hired him to preserve the lighthouse after severe storm damage. During that project, they discovered something hidden inside the original stone foundation. I leaned closer without speaking. Letters, she whispered. Dozens of them. The room suddenly felt smaller. Every clue I had chased over the past several days now pointed toward the same place. Those letters were not business records, Madeline continued. They were personal correspondence proving that your father had been falsely blamed for a decision that divided two families many years ago. He believed releasing them immediately would create more pain than healing, because too many people were still alive to misuse the truth. I closed my eyes briefly. So he hid them? Yes, she answered. But he also feared they would disappear forever if no one remembered where they belonged. That is why he asked my grandfather to protect the location, not the documents themselves. And after your grandfather passed away? She looked down at the unopened envelope. The responsibility became mine. Silence settled between us while distant applause drifted through the conservatory windows. For the first time since hearing that forgotten phone call, the impossible became clear. Madeline had never been hiding the truth from me to protect herself. She had been protecting a promise made to my father long before we had ever fallen in love. I reached toward the envelope, but before my fingers touched the wax seal, Daniel Mercer hurried into the conservatory with unusual urgency. He stopped just inside the doorway and looked directly at me. Nathaniel, he said quietly, someone broke into Black Harbor Lighthouse this morning. Nothing appears to have been stolen, but the hidden archive has definitely been opened before we ever arrived. Daniel's words settled over the conservatory like a sudden winter wind, leaving the sunlight pouring through the glass ceiling strangely meaningless. I looked at Madeline expecting panic, but instead I saw something even more unsettling. Relief. It lasted only a heartbeat before concern returned to her face, yet I had seen it clearly. She slowly released a breath she had apparently been holding for years. Then they are finally moving, she whispered almost to herself. I frowned. Who is moving? She shook her head gently. The people who have been waiting for these letters to disappear forever. Daniel stepped closer, placing a thin folder on the antique table beside the unopened envelope. Local authorities reported no damage to the building, he explained. The hidden compartment inside the lighthouse was opened carefully. Whoever entered knew exactly where to look. There were no broken locks, no forced entry, and almost no fingerprints. It looked less like a burglary, and more like someone returning to a place they already knew. My thoughts immediately returned to every photograph I had seen over the past several days. My father, Thomas Brooks, the lighthouse, the letters. Every road led back to the same forgotten landmark standing against the Atlantic. Were the letters taken? I asked. Daniel hesitated. That is the strange part. Walter Griffin says the original bundle appears untouched, but he believes someone photographed every page before putting them back exactly where they were. Silence filled the room. Whoever had entered did not need to steal the truth anymore. They simply needed to copy it. Madeline slowly lowered herself into one of the wooden chairs beside the table. She rested both hands on the unopened envelope and closed her eyes for a moment. This is exactly what your father feared, she said quietly. Once the letters existed in more than one place, no one could control how they would be used. I studied her face carefully. For the first time, I was no longer searching for deception. I was searching for understanding. Tell me everything you have not told me. She looked up with eyes carrying equal parts exhaustion and hope. I will. But first you need to hear one more truth. She reached into her handbag and removed a small digital voice recorder no larger than my palm. I received this yesterday morning. Someone left it inside my office without any note. She pressed the play button. Static crackled for several seconds before two unfamiliar voices emerged. He already suspects her, one man said calmly. Another answered with a quiet laugh. Good. Let him keep following the wrong story. By the time he reaches the lighthouse, everyone will believe the letters came from her family. The recording ended. No names. No explanations. Only a carefully planned attempt to redirect suspicion. I stared at the recorder while every assumption I had made over the past week quietly collapsed. Someone had known I would overhear the phone call. Someone had known I would investigate Madeline instead of asking her questions. Someone had patiently guided every clue toward misunderstanding. Why did you not show me this immediately? I asked. She looked down at the recorder before answering. Because I was afraid that if I showed you without proof, you would believe someone had fabricated it to manipulate you. I almost laughed at the painful irony. Instead, I manipulated myself. Neither of us spoke for several long moments. Beyond the conservatory windows, guests continued gathering beneath white tents overlooking the ocean. A string quartet rehearsed another melody, while photographers arranged families into perfect rows. The celebration continued exactly as planned, completely unaware that another story had quietly unfolded beneath every smiling photograph. Daniel broke the silence by opening the folder he had carried. Inside were enlarged copies of security images taken near Black Harbor Lighthouse early that morning. The photographs were grainy, but one detail stood out immediately. Parked near the entrance was a dark sedan registered to a holding company I recognized at once. It belonged to Victor Langford, the businessman who had unsuccessfully tried to acquire Hayes Logistics 3 years earlier after my father's death. Publicly, he had accepted defeat with grace. Privately, he had never stopped searching for leverage. Daniel looked directly at me. If these letters can rewrite your father's legacy, they can also reshape the future of your company. And someone appears determined to release only part of the truth. I looked at Madeline, then at the sealed envelope resting between us. Suddenly I understood that the greatest danger had never been the hidden letters themselves. It was the incomplete stories surrounding them. For the first time since this impossible chain of events had begun, I stopped looking at Madeline as someone hiding the truth and started looking at her as someone carrying it alone. The difference changed everything. I picked up the sealed envelope from the table but did not break the wax seal. Instead, I carefully placed it back into her hands. My father trusted you, I said quietly. If he believed you should decide when this is opened, then I will honor that choice. Her eyes filled with surprise, followed by something even quieter. Relief. She lowered her head for a moment as though a burden she had carried for years had suddenly become lighter. Thank you, she whispered. I know that was not easy. I smiled faintly. It was not. Daniel remained silent beside us, understanding that this conversation had moved beyond investigation. It had become something far more personal. Outside the conservatory, the music continued drifting through the gardens while guests gathered near the ocean terrace waiting for the engagement celebration to begin. The estate still looked perfect. White roses lined the stone walkways. Crystal glasses reflected the afternoon sun. Every photograph taken that day would capture elegance. None would reveal how close we had come to destroying our own future simply because we had stopped talking to each other. Madeline reached into her handbag again and unfolded an old hand-drawn map that had clearly been opened many times before. Its edges had faded with age, and several notes written by hand surrounded a rough sketch of Black Harbor Lighthouse. She placed it on the table between us. My grandfather drew this after the restoration project was completed, she explained. He believed someone might eventually need it if the original builder's plans were ever lost. I leaned closer. Hidden behind the lighthouse foundation was a narrow storage chamber that connected to an older maintenance passage, no longer shown on any official blueprint. That is how someone entered without forcing the locks, Daniel observed immediately. Madeline nodded. Only 4 people ever knew that passage existed. My grandfather, your father, Walter Griffin, and me. I looked at the map again. Until now. She met my eyes. Yes. Until now. We decided there would be no more secrets between us. Daniel would travel ahead to coordinate with Walter Griffin while Madeline and I would leave after the evening gathering. We agreed not to announce our destination to anyone. Publicly, everyone would believe we were taking a short private trip before the wedding ceremony. Privately, we were racing to protect the complete truth before someone released only fragments of it. As we finalized the plan, my phone vibrated with an incoming message from an unknown number. Attached was a scanned image of one of the lighthouse letters. Across the top someone had highlighted a single sentence in red. At first glance it appeared devastating. It seemed to suggest that my father had willingly concealed information from both families. My stomach tightened until I noticed something unusual. The page ended in the middle of a sentence. The final paragraph was missing entirely. Madeline looked at the image for only a second before shaking her head. That is not the full letter. How do you know? I asked. She pointed toward the bottom margin. Because every original page contained my grandfather's preservation mark after restoration. It should be right here. Her fingertip rested over an empty corner. Someone deliberately cropped the page before sending it to you. Daniel immediately understood the implication. They are preparing the public to believe a false version of the story before the complete evidence can be seen. I slowly lowered the phone. The recording, the anonymous photographs, the carefully selected clues, the missing paragraph. None of it had been random. Every move had been designed to make honest people reach the wrong conclusion on their own. I looked at Madeline and realized how close I had come to becoming exactly the person our unseen opponent expected me to be. She gently took my hand without saying a word. This time I did not hesitate. Whatever waited for us at Black Harbor Lighthouse, we would face it together. Then another message appeared on my screen, containing only 6 chilling words that confirmed. We were already one step behind. The second recording has been released. I opened the second recording before fear had a chance to convince me not to. The audio began with familiar static, followed by Madeline's voice, clear enough that I could almost believe she was standing beside me instead of only a few feet away in the conservatory. If he ever learns the truth, promise me you will burn every letter before sunrise. The recording paused there for several seconds before continuing with words I had never heard. Because if anyone finds them before he knows the whole story, they will use his father's sacrifice to destroy everything he has built. Silence filled the room. No one spoke. No one moved. The sentence I had spent days believing proved betrayal had become the very sentence that proved devotion. I closed my eyes, remembering every suspicious glance, every quiet investigation, every moment I had chosen doubt instead of trust. I had not been protecting our future. I had been slowly damaging it with my own assumptions. Madeline did not look angry. That somehow hurt even more. She simply looked tired, as though carrying this burden alone had exhausted her long before I entered her life. I wanted to tell you, she whispered. I almost told you so many times. But your father made me promise that the letters would only matter when you were finally ready to read all of them together. Never one page. Never one sentence. Never one recording. I looked toward the unopened envelope resting between us. He knew someone would eventually try to separate the story. She nodded. He believed incomplete truth could be more dangerous than a complete lie. Daniel quietly stepped toward the windows, scanning the gardens below while giving us a moment that belonged only to us. Outside, guests continued smiling beneath white tents as photographers captured another perfect memory. None of them knew that the real turning point of my life had happened inside a quiet conservatory instead of at the celebration prepared for us. I finally spoke the words I should have asked days earlier. Why did he choose you? Madeline smiled sadly. Because my grandfather once saved those letters from storm damage after part of the lighthouse collapsed. Your father said our family had already protected the truth once. He trusted that we would protect it again until the right moment. I slowly shook my head, overwhelmed less by the mystery than by the simplicity of what had happened. My father had trusted her years before I ever met her. She had honored that promise without asking for recognition, gratitude, or even understanding. I reached for her hand, and this time she did not hesitate to hold mine. I am sorry, I said quietly. Not because I asked questions. Because I asked everyone except you. A single tear escaped before she smiled again. Then ask me now. Before I could answer, Daniel turned back toward us holding his phone. Walter Griffin just called, he said. He confirmed every original letter is still inside the lighthouse archive. But there is something else. He placed the call on speaker. Walter's calm voice carried the weariness of a man who had guarded history for decades. The copies are already spreading, he said. People will soon believe your father hid the truth for selfish reasons because they only have fragments. There is only one way to stop it now. You must release every letter together with the final document your father left behind." I frowned. Final document? Walter hesitated before answering. The personal confession he wrote the night before he died. My heart seemed to stop. I had searched through years of family records and never found any confession. "Where is it?" I asked. Walter answered with quiet certainty. "Inside the sealed envelope addressed to Madeline. Your father told me that if the day ever came when lies began traveling faster than truth, only she would know whether you had become the kind of man ready to read his final words." Madeline looked at the sealed envelope for a long time before finally lifting it with both hands. No one spoke. Even the distant music drifting in from the garden seemed to fade into silence, as she carefully broke the aging wax seal that had remained untouched for more than a decade. She unfolded a single handwritten letter, and before reading it herself, she quietly placed it into my hands. "He wanted these words to belong to you," she whispered. The paper trembled slightly as I began reading my father's unmistakable handwriting. "Nathaniel, if you are reading this, then the day I feared has finally arrived. You will be tempted to judge people by fragments because fragments are easier to carry than the whole truth. Do not repeat my greatest mistake. I nearly lost everything because I believed silence was enough to protect the people I loved. It was not. One day you will meet someone who values truth more than comfort. Trust that person, even when the truth arrives slowly." I stopped reading for a moment because the words no longer felt like a letter. They felt like my father standing beside me after all these years. I continued. "The letters hidden beneath Black Harbor Lighthouse were never meant to protect my reputation. They were meant to protect another family that had already suffered enough because of my decisions. Thomas Brooks understood that better than anyone. If his granddaughter ever stands beside you, know that she has already carried a burden I should never have asked her to bear." My vision blurred as I lowered the page. Every suspicion I had built over the past several days collapsed beneath the weight of one simple realization. Madeline had not entered my life carrying secrets against me. She had entered my life carrying my father's unfinished promise. I looked at her, struggling to find words that could measure the depth of my mistake. "You spent years protecting a man you had never even met," I said quietly. She smiled through tearful eyes. "I spent years protecting the future he hoped you would have." Daniel respectfully stepped outside the conservatory, giving us privacy while continuing to monitor the growing situation surrounding the copied letters. Beyond the glass walls, guests remained unaware that the celebration had quietly transformed into something far more meaningful than an engagement party. I folded my father's letter with extraordinary care before placing it back inside the envelope. Then I took a slow breath and made the first decision that truly belonged to me rather than to fear. "We are not going to hide anymore," I said. "Tomorrow we go to Black Harbor Lighthouse together. We recover every original document, release the complete truth, and let every page speak for itself." Madeline nodded without hesitation. "That is exactly what your father hoped you would choose." My phone vibrated again. This time it was not another anonymous message. It was a public news alert already spreading across financial media. Someone had released selected images of the copied letters together, with misleading commentary suggesting that my father had concealed evidence for personal gain. Hayes Logistics had already become the center of speculation, and investors were demanding answers before the markets opened the following morning. I looked at the headlines only briefly before locking the screen. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, panic no longer controlled my decisions. Truth did. I slipped my father's letter into the inside pocket of my jacket, reached for Madeline's hand, and together we walked out of the conservatory toward the waiting guests. We still smiled for every photograph, but now those smiles came from a different place. We were no longer pretending everything was perfect. We simply knew that some storms had to be walked through together before the sky could finally clear. And somewhere 400 miles north, Black Harbor Lighthouse waited beneath the Atlantic wind, holding the last pieces of a story that was finally ready to be told exactly as it had happened. The drive to Black Harbor Lighthouse began before sunrise, with the Atlantic stretching beside us beneath a sky painted in pale shades of blue and silver. 400 miles disappeared beneath the tires almost without my noticing because my attention remained fixed on the woman sitting beside me. Madeline rested my father's envelope safely inside a leather portfolio, while occasionally looking out the window at the coastline passing by. Neither of us felt the need to fill every mile with conversation. For the first time since I had overheard that forgotten phone call, silence no longer stood between us. It walked beside us. Honest. Peaceful. By early afternoon the lighthouse finally appeared above the rocky shoreline exactly as it had in every faded photograph. Time seemed to have left it untouched. Walter Griffin waited at the entrance with the same weathered patience carried by men who had spent decades protecting promises instead of possessions. Without ceremony, he guided us through the narrow maintenance passage hidden behind the original stone foundation. At the end of the corridor rested a small archive protected inside a climate-controlled chamber. The letters remained exactly where my father had left them. So did every restoration record prepared by Thomas Brooks. Walter quietly placed the complete collection onto a wooden table. "Now read them together," he said. We spent hours turning each page slowly, never separating one letter from the next. Every missing paragraph completed another misunderstanding. Every overlooked page restored another piece of my father's story. He had accepted public criticism years earlier rather than expose another family's private tragedy. Thomas Brooks had agreed to preserve that decision until enough time had passed for truth to heal instead of divide. Madeline had inherited that responsibility without ever asking for it. By sunset we possessed something more valuable than evidence. We possessed the entire story. Daniel coordinated with our legal team while the complete archive, accompanied by my father's final confession and independent historical records, was released exactly as he had instructed. There were no edited excerpts. No dramatic headlines. No missing pages. Only the truth presented from beginning to end. Within hours the speculation surrounding Hayes' logistics began to fade as historians, journalists, and legal experts confirmed the documents were authentic and complete. Victor Langford's carefully selected fragments lost their power the moment the full record became available for everyone to examine. Standing outside the lighthouse, I watched the final sunlight disappear beyond the Atlantic, while the beacon slowly came alive above us. I turned toward Madeline, remembering the first whisper that had nearly convinced me I had lost her before I had ever truly known her. "I almost allowed fear to write our story," I said quietly. She smiled with the same warmth that had first changed my life. "But you chose to finish reading instead." We returned to the estate several days later, not to celebrate perfection, but to begin something far more meaningful. The grand ballroom no longer mattered. The expensive decorations no longer mattered. Instead of announcing another extravagant event, Madeline unfolded the restoration plan she had carried from the very beginning and placed them across the old oak table in the library. They were designs for transforming an abandoned historic schoolhouse near the coast into a community learning center where local families could preserve photographs, journals, letters, and personal history before time erased them forever. I looked at the blueprints, then at the woman beside me, and finally understood what my father had wanted me to inherit. Not influence. Not wealth. Responsibility. We left the library together as evening settled across the cliffs, the lighthouse shining faintly on the distant horizon like a promise finally kept. I once believed power meant controlling every outcome before it could hurt me. Now I know something far greater. A person can build an empire through fear, but only truth, patience, and trust can build a home that survives every storm. If this story stayed with you, please subscribe, like, and share it with someone who would enjoy it too. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.